If you want to support the channel on Patreon and other forms of social media, links are in the description below. Back in the last generation, Finns were pretty desperate for wrestling game fans. Seriously, we'd been so used to lots of different styles of games. We had Fire Pro, but then Spike retired and or made a god-awful Finn with avatars on the 360, whichever you prefer. We had Aki, who did the almighty No Mercy and the Def Jam games, but then they left the table, and as for Def Jam, well, less said the better. And of course, there was SmackDown. But midway through the PS2 generation, that just stopped being good. The glorious mania of Here Comes the Pain had been replaced with something a lot more restrictive and, well, bland. And on the 360 it was frankly dog shit for the most part. And it was also basically the only game in town. Desperate times for the wrestling fan. Some retreated back into the older titles. Others who leaned more towards the dark arts might have followed the Church of M. Dickey on the PC, or got deep into booking with Total Extreme Wrestling. Maybe you decided to hold your breath for Pro Wrestling X too, and if you did that, then by this point you'd have been long dead because that game still isn't finished. But if you were desperate for an alternative to SmackDown on consoles, well, you pretty much had just a couple of choices. Ukes had some other games like Legends of WrestleMania and WWE All-Stars, but one's a simplified SmackDown and the other is a bit too arcadey for a lot of tastes. There's TNA Impact, which I imagine we'll probably get to eventually. Now sure, it's TNA and everything, and it's hardly the best game, put it mildly, but there are some things to appreciate there. And it is better than the ultimate, true bad ending alternative. If you're really desperate, you might well go to the game we're covering today. It's Konami, and it's Rumble Rosa's Double X. If you took a look at the cover and somehow mustered the inner strength and testicular fortitude to take it up to the shop counter and actually buy the damn thing, you were promised some Japanese women's wrestling action. Sure, the wrestlers aren't real or anything, but hey, it's wrestling, right? Maybe it'll be a viable alternative to those WWE games. Yeah. Rumble Rosa's got its start on the PS2 and had a story mode and everything, but the 360 version seems to be more notable and, these days, a fair bit more common. The fact that it only features women makes it somewhat unique, being that it's the first women-only wrestling game for many years. If you're really into your Japanese wrestling, you'll know that back in the glorious 80s and 90s, and long before the WWE's Women's Revolution, Joshi Pro Wrest was just as big as men's wrestling, and the wrestlers were just as good. It was filled with pioneers and legends of the ring, creating some of the best and most dramatic matches that you can find anywhere. Akira Hokuto, Bull Nakano, Manami Toyota, Mayumi Yazaki, the terrifying Aja Kong. In these days, the men quite often were taking inspiration from the women in the ring. Fortunately, as with plain old ProRes in the mid-2000s, Joshi was on a big downturn, so Rumble Rosa's wasn't ever going to feature any actual licensed wrestlers or anything. Not that there was ever any intention of making a serious wrestling sim to begin with, but we'll get to that. The lead producer was Akari Uchida, who had largely worked on Tokimeki Memorial dating sim games. The overarching plot was that a mad doctor was holding an international women's wrestling tournament with the intention to take DNA from the stars and create super soldiers out of them, although you won't get any of this plot in Rumble Rosa's Double X. And everyone seems to be wearing very little in the way of clothes, don't they? So yes, this game leans a lot more towards the anime side of things. A lot more. Look, let's not mince words. This game is trash. Flat out, absolute trash. Now, it's not as if I'm offended by the game's existence, I'm not that sort of reviewer. It's just that the whole thing is a cavalcade of pure cringe, where just about every moment of pure and uncut fan service leaves me wincing to the point where you might just think I'm doing racist Japanese impressions. Even before you get into a match, you're going to be disappointed. Wrestler creation options are basically non-existent, you're limited only to making about 30 odd wrestlers and they're all going to be based on the existing wrestlers, giving them a few different clothes, a different name and such. Actual progression is pretty All you really do is wrestle with your chosen idol, superstar, and the more you win, the better your stats become. It's all very bare bones indeed. And then when it comes to choosing a wrestler to fight with, why does the display feature them lying down as if they were posing for a body pillow? And that's when you know just about where you're headed here. Playing the Finn will leave you really cringing. The intros feature some of the worst music imaginable. It's really hard to believe that people like Akira Yamaoka and Michiru freaking Yamane were involved in the soundtrack. They actually were. Tons of ridiculous poses, Finns that make no sense whatsoever, and folks who are ready to fight in massive high heels. I wouldn't have thought that such footwear would be ideal for Lewin, but hey, we'll run with it. Or not, as the case may be. The matches themselves? Well, what's with all these camera angles? They seem to be just at the right place, not to see a move, but to get a good strong look at the wrestler's arse. You can even move the camera around for a totally primo view during the very grunty and groany submission moves. Yeah. Or you can even perform humiliation moves, most likely match enders, that feature spanking and what have you, and a whole lot more groaning. There's groaning from the wrestlers, there's plenty of groans from yourself too. Although perhaps not the sort that the game was made for you to perform. At least I hope not. The ultimate cringe comes from the Queen's match, which takes place on a beach. For the most part it's a normal match, but at the end of it, well, the loser has to perform some sort of act. They can be tickled with a big hand, or spanked perhaps, or have to perform some limbo, something like that. And this scene can be on loop. You can change the camera angle to get the best possible view. Truly, this is the wrestling experience come to life. What, you thought that fulfill your fantasy in the SmackDown games was cringeworthy? You didn't play this. This is... Look, basically it's apartment wrestling, the video game. Nothing but grunting, groaning and extreme close-up camera angles. It's like something you'd find in the back of an old Pro Wrestling Illustrated. And again, I hope you can realise, I'm not offended as such, but it's just embarrassing. It's like, geez, this is in my fucking collection now? This is what I have to stoop to in order to get some alternative to the drudgery of 360 era SmackDown? And you know what? That's the real kicker. Because guess who had a big hand in developing this game? Yep, Ukes. As far as the actual wrestling goes, those who've played a lot of SmackDown, as I have, may well notice some frightfully familiar things about the game after a bit. The way the reversal system works, several of the animations for moves, hits, knockdowns, the way you build up finishers or killer moves or whatever. This is a bloody SmackDown game! The original Rumble Roses uses the same engine that was used in Here Comes the Pain, and it doesn't appear to have been changed much for XX. Now you could think that, hey, that's SmackDown at its best. Isn't that a good thing? But nah. Like the SmackDown games after it, all the good things about HCTP have been sucked out of this, only this time replaced with fan service. Fan service further than the eyes can see. Fan service that makes you worry if by buying this game, you've ended up on a watch list somewhere.
Endless trash!
Now, I'm sure there are some people who found this appealing and, hey, whatever floats your boat, I guess. Not me. Honestly, I've always found the sexiness of video game characters to be just a rather daft concept in general. Look, even as a typically horny teenager, I grew up with Lara Croft on the PS1, and even then, well, look, all the special issues of The Face and double page spreads or whatever wouldn't convince me that her boobs were not ridiculously pointy fins made out of triangles, and that getting a bonker for her was silly when there were plenty of other mags or whatever with, you know, actual girls in them. The poses, kinky costumes and tickling action of Rumble Roses has zero effect on me either in terms of being aroused or offended. It's just, you know, silly. Really silly. Tremendously, totally, utterly, colossally, incredibly, indubitably silly. Too silly. Still, some people liked it. I will never understand why the game actually came out in the West. Maybe considering that women's wrestling in the mainstream was chock full of shitty bra and panties matches and the like at the time, Konami thought that, hey, maybe this will have some appeal. But again, With wrestling fans, you're kind of dealing with people who are likely a lot more interested in real girls than virtual ones. That and it being a shit game meant that Rumble Roses XX was an utter flop in the West that barely sold any copies at all. It did perform well for the 360 in Japan, relatively speaking anyways, where it ended up on the top 20 of games sold on the platform after the console's first year. And this was the last entry in the whole shebang, so there's not a whole lot more to say about it. But this was the state of play for the wrestling fan in the mid-late 2000s who was sick of endless average SmackDown games. This was the alternative. And it wasn't even a bloody alternative. Dark times indeed. I mean, it's not like things are a lot better now. I mean, thank heaven for the return of Fire Pro. The churches of M. Dickey and Adam Wyland are still there, and the WWE monolith is more bloated, corpulent, and stagnant than ever. In closing then, whoever convinced Aki that they should change their name to Sin Sophia and stop making wrestling games should be kicked square out in the bloody nuts. Bye for now. The community gives thanks to the following: Adam Schaefer, Alex Stocco, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Audie Sawley, Conformist, Daniel Briggs, Daniel David Taylor, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Ghostly Spectre, Guatham Blackpaw, Hunter, Iain Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Durso, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, Josh Jensen, Lee Norris, Mark Johnston, Martin Pataki, Morten Skanin, Nanette McCrone, Nicholas Tristan, Olaf Albin, Peter Jack, Peter Sidorn, Phil Taprog, Pocky Southmaid, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Burford, Sammy Lee, Samuel Victor, Scott Coulter, Sean Zoltek, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stephen Warner, The Unnatural, Tanyo J, Yucca Operator, and Zach Roach.